Hi, this is Larry Bauer, Chief Executive Officer of the Family Medicine Education Consortium, and today I'm talking with Dr. Tom Wilkinson, a family physician who is got a very interesting and somewhat atypical career path as a family physician. He's currently in a leadership position with the Peace Corps. He is the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Health Informatics Officer, Chief Patient Safety Officer, and then I think there's probably a couple other things that that Tom can throw in if he would like to. Tom, thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Larry.
So, Tom, can you tell us about your background? Where'd you grow up? How'd you end up going to medical school, residency, etc.?
Okay, I grew up in Maryland. I come from a very large family. I have 11 brothers and sisters, and we divided our time between southern Maryland, where the family farm is, and suburban Washington, which is where my dad had his business. And I, as an undergraduate, went to University of Maryland at College Park. It was the state school and affordable at that time. I know it's no longer very affordable. And I did twin degrees, one in architecture and one in art history. And before I graduated undergraduate, I took 2 years off and worked in archaeology. And after graduating, I continued to work in archaeology for pretty much the entire decade of the 80s and into the 90s. At some point, there was a major change in my thinking. My mother became sick and eventually died from breast cancer. And I began to think that I was spending my time with with dead people, and it just turned me around. One of the things I should mention is that where I worked, which was largely Mediterranean cultures, many of the osteologists, the bone specialists, the physical anthropologists, are MDs. They are doctors who do residency in osteology and physical anthropology. And so I was rubbing shoulders with physical anthropologists and who had medical backgrounds. And so I think there was a kind of a confluence of ideas that sometime I think I was in Greece working at Delphi. I just made up my mind. I was going to medical school, and that was probably the most conscious decision I ever made in my life. Most of the time I kind of flow, and this was a decision. And so I came back to College Park and did a lot of pre-med in one big swallow, and applied to University of Maryland in Baltimore, again sticking to state schools which were affordable, and actually matriculated into the MD PhD program, and was working on a very esoteric PhD that my committee was not really understanding, and I was very frustrated. And this was when my mom was dying, and when I actually met my future wife, and I changed my mind entirely. I was thinking I was going into academics. I was very interested in my research, and my wife comes from a tiny little town in Maine, up in the mountains near the New Hampshire border, and when we were dating, the only thing I could see when we would go to her family farm was how much primary care was needed and how hard it was to do it right. And I think there's something about having that intellectual challenge of being good at all things, which is not a possibility, but I sure wanted to try. And again, kind of remarking on that, I was frustrated with the direction that the PhD was going, and I was and I was having a major personal upheaval with the death of my mom. So I once again made a decision and decided that what I wanted to do was family medicine, and so I withdrew from the research side of the PhD, went right back into clinical medicine, and haven't looked back ever since.
That's quite a story, quite a path. And then where did you go for your residency?
I went to Abington Memorial Hospital, which is just north of Philadelphia, and a very strong family medicine program, and then the hospital itself has multiple residencies, and it was I thought it was an excellent postgraduate education, and then after that I stayed on as faculty for another 2 years beyond that.
And then what happened?
Again, my wife grew up in a very small town, and we were living in Philadelphia, or just north of it, at the time. And we were sitting at a traffic light one day, and Philadelphia traffic lights cycle very fast. And it cycled green, and the woman in front of us hesitated a minute, and then she went through, and it turned red. And my wife said, "That's it, we're moving. I can't stand it anymore." and So I said, "Oh, okay." I actually kind of loved it. You know, there's this academic bent to me, and I loved the position I had. I was at faculty for evidence-based medicine and clinical informatics at the residency program. I really loved that job, and loved my colleagues at the job, and loved teaching. But I also loved my wife and made a decision. So I said, okay, well, it's either Maine or Maryland, and Maine is pretty cold, so let's try Maryland. And so we circled back to the family farm, and I arranged with my many siblings to purchase their interest for the family farm, and then we took over, and we've been there ever since.
Great. And then when did you practice clinically? Did you not for a while?
Yeah, for about, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt it. For about 10 or 12, I guess it was 12 years total. I had a private practice in Leonardtown, Maryland, which is the southern tip of the western shore of Maryland, where the Potomac and the Chesapeake are confluent, and that's about 10 minutes from my farm. And and I had private practice, and it was quite a privilege to be a family doctor in a rural community. I knew just about everybody. I took care of so many people. It was such a privilege. It was very different than Philadelphia. Philadelphia, you could walk out of patient hours, and if you weren't on call, you kind of merged into the rest of humanity, and were otherwise very anonymous. And in Southern Maryland, I was never anonymous. I was always the doctor, and it didn't matter if I was at a soccer game, or if I was at Walmart in the diaper department. It didn't matter where I was. There was always somebody walking up to me and saying, my mom's not doing well, or can you look at this? People showed up at my house. It took a lot to get used to basically being continuously on call, to be always the doctor. But but in the end, you grow to meet the need. It's one of the features of family medicine, I think, is that you grow to fit the need of your community, and it became just a tremendous privilege. But the transition came in 2008, which is the end of 2008 was when the recession occurred, and boy, did that have an impact. At that point, I think my practice was at 3 sites, and we had 9 providers and about 30 staff, and and we were doing well. I think 2007 was probably our best year, and then 2008 happened, and the bottom dropped out of the economy, and in a rural area, healthcare is something of expendable income. It's you don't address things unless you just, if you have the money or you have the insurance, you address them. And if you don't, you do not. And so we started losing numbers. And of course the insurance industry has always held the upper hand in negotiations with small independent practices. And so I basically wandered into a perfect storm that I couldn't keep productivity up. I was working at the hospital, I was working at the office, and we still weren't making ends meet. And I was on a trajectory that was clearly not survivable. And that, I think, is a familiar story for a lot of small practices, small primary care practices. And so as I was chief of family medicine at the time at the hospital, and as part of that role was engaged with MedStar Healthcare, which MedStar is a large consortium of hospitals in the Baltimore, Washington area, and they were interested in acquiring our hospital, which until that point had been a small independent hospital. And so I was part of those negotiations, and somewhere during the time I said, would you be interested in my practice? MedStar had, prior to me, had some specialty practices, but they never had a primary care practice. I was their first experience in primary care. I was also their first experience in a rural primary care practice. So I was thinking that we were going to, I thought we were going to learn from each other, but working for a larger healthcare organization, corporate organization, it always comes down to the people who you work with or for. And in the end, my immediate supervisor was somebody who I just couldn't see my way through. We just had serious disagreements on priorities. I tried to explain that we were that in a rural community, you have to take care of the patient, and his point, which is valid, is that you have to take care of the business, and otherwise you can't take care of the patient. And so we were just at odds on prioritization. So in the end, I was somewhat unhappy working there. Not only because my experience up until that point had been, I charted my own course, and now I was part of a larger organization. So I was taking at the time rotations from from medical students from University of Maryland and residents from Baltimore, and I had a resident who was a former Peace Corps volunteer, and she had an MPH. She did that prior to medical school. She was a third-year family practice resident, and so I said, well, what we should probably do is let's call up the Peace Corps and see whether the doctor who was the chief medical officer at the time was somebody who in his previous life had been an intensivist at Washington Hospital Center, and I had used him previously when I sent patients up to Washington Hospital Center. So I knew him not only collegially, professionally anyway. And I said, let me just give him a call and let's see if you can do a kind of a sub-rotation for a couple of weeks up at Peace Corps, and let's see if your MPH can be put to use. Well, it turns out that it wasn't meant to be. There was a lot of impediments. You have to have, after 9/11, there have to be security clearance to enter the building. So, but what that did was it renewed a contact that I had with Dr. Barry Simon, who at the time was running the healthcare system in Peace. And he knew of my background in archaeology. And one day he called me up. I had had a particularly frustrating day that day he called me up from Peru and said, I am looking at Machu Picchu. You have got to do this job. And that's what set me on the course. I had a large non-compete clause with my contract with MedStar that I needed to relocate or relocate my practice anyway outside of Southern Maryland. Washington, D.C. was the probably the most proximal location that I could practice, given my non-compete. And so I interviewed with Barry, and he hired me, and I've been at Peace Corps now since 2012.
Tom, that is just one heck of a story. Amazing the stepping stones to where you are right now. If you could describe for people, what do you like about the work that you're doing? You've been there for a while, and you've told me some very interesting stories. You told when you were a plenary speaker at our meeting, you told some very interesting stories. What is it that keeps you there?
Clinically, it is a fascinating job. Everything so to be clear, my patients are Peace Corps volunteers. I don't take care of I don't take care of our host country nationals. I take care of the volunteers who are in service. That's my legal obligation from the Peace Corps Act. And so volunteers demographically tend to be 22 to 30-year-olds for the most part, and then there's a kind of bimodal distribution. There's a whole nother collection, smaller minority proportion that are over 50, and so every medical problem that a person might have in the United States, they all have those. Some of them we just can't take them in the field. Their medical problems are too complicated. But for the most part, we try to accommodate as best we can. We try to accommodate whatever people have medically. We try to accommodate them in the field, and so everything that they have coming in from the United States, we still take care of. So all that primary care still comes. But the thing that's new, the wrinkle that Peace Corps adds, is that everything that happens in country also happens to them. And so every kind of, it's not just malaria, it's Loa. It's cases that the CDC calls and says, do you know about this, or have you seen one of these? Our volunteers don't live in the capital city the way State Department does. We live out in the villages, and in many ways, we are the first to see events like Ebola or chikungunya, or we're the first to see when something has spread to an area, and it's not because we definitely don't try to put our volunteers in harm's way. It's just that the nature of the work is away from the accoutrements of civilization, which include things like closed windows or air conditioners or screens on your windows, and so they are exposed to many more things. And so clinically, it's a rich experience. I don't think there's a day that goes by that I haven't learned something new, something different.
Sounds like it aligns well with your basic drive.
Yeah, the do everything drive. Yeah. So but my other role is chief of health informatics for Peace Corps, and that is also exciting, but a completely different facet of medicine. We here at Peace Corps, we built we built an electronic medical record system to suit Peace Corps' needs, and that EMR is it's unique in a lot of ways. It's a global EMR. It's a distributed network, a kind of hub and spokes model, with the hub being in the cloud, and we have basically learned how to do the final mile in electronic medical record systems. Most systems you need to be plugged in to work, and ours you don't. And I think it's very unique that basically that our medical officers in country, when they need to go way up country and take care of somebody, can basically take their laptop and still work, still see the complete. And we have we also built in a number of things like a kind of telementoring, telemedicine model where we are, I just finished this morning report just a few moments ago, where we basically collaboratively take care of volunteers. There are doctors in country who we work with, and then myself and 3 other doctors here at headquarters in Washington who all work collaboratively through this EMR. We see each other's work. We have basically clinical conversations as a part of the record in this in the medical record system. Really a unique thing, and we built it all in-house from scratch. I'm really proud of it, and we're getting ready to release our second version sometime in 2019. And the health informatics unit didn't exist in Peace Corps previously, and government being what it is, it's hard to move a bureaucracy. It's hard to create something new, but I built this unit up, and it's and now we have developers and clinicians and help and everything else built right in, and it's such a rich culture to have clinicians talk to developers and make a medical record system that actually works. We get fan mail from our users. I don't know any other medical record system that gets fan mail.
I'll say. That's wonderful. Congratulations on that. So
Thanks.
Let me just, I'm going to need to bring things to closure, Tom. What would you recommendations? You've now, you're a senior level person. You've had a very unique pathway. What would you say to young people, medical students who are residents, who are thinking of, preparing for their careers? What recommendations would you have for them so that they might also have as rich a career as yours?
I think the most important thing is when you're young, you have such a preconception of what it should be like, what life should be like, what your career should be like, and for many of us, I mean, thinking of the first day of medical school, there was this rude awakening of the idyllic perception of what med school should be, and then the reality was different. Well, I would say just take that lesson that all of us experience and apply it to the rest of your life. Let life dish something out to you. Don't always be completely in control, because sometimes unique things happen, unique opportunities happen, and I can tell you, when I lost control of my practice, I was deeply unhappy. But I landed on my feet, and it was, I guess, a willingness to embrace whatever was coming, and not to give up when it didn't happen the way I had predetermined it. I think that's the key message: is don't let there be a give and take. Let life deliver some of the things that happen to you, and then you push back when you need to. That's my message.
I think that's a powerful message for all of us. So, Tom, I want to thank you very much for talking with us today, and I look forward to our next conversation. I always enjoy the times we get to spend some time together, so thank you very much.
You're welcome, Larry. Thank you for having me.